So Tim Clark, President of Emirates, thank you so much for joining us at ITB this year, virtually, unfortunately, but we're very grateful that you've taken the time to join us. Thank you. I think it's fair to say that Emirates is a pretty unique airline. I mean, you would obviously, if you had your marketer's hat on for a moment, you would talk about all the unique parts about its cabins and service and all those kind of things. But, equally, its ownership, the scale of the airline and the speed in which it's grown is very unique as well. And your home country where you're based, has fared fairly well during the pandemic. I wanted to just kick us off, if you could, Sir Tim, would you say Emirates has had a unique way of handling itself as an airline during the last 12 months of this crisis?
Well, I think we're no different in the presentation of the collapse of demand across the planet. And of course, being a full service international medium long haul carrier, of course, we've had to take our fair share of pain in just that. But we very quickly adjusted the model to take up what was clearly an opportunity, and that was cargo. So we now have just about all our 777s flying, about 140 of them, a mixture of cargo operations and passenger stroke cargo, as we did before. Less passengers, of course, but high amounts of cargo. So that basically kept the wolf from door as far as the cash situation was concerned.
Okay, so if we can move on to looking at this year, if we can. I mean, there's been a lot of, and perhaps too much reflection on the last year, but how do you sense air traffic will develop now from in Asia, Europe and Africa in 2021 and beyond first?
Well, I've always been very bullish about it, frankly. I'm a bit of an outlier. When we sort out the difficulties of the vaccine programs, the various, what I call the vaccine wars, and then eventually the need and the understanding of the need to have some kind of evidence of having a vaccine, and that has multiple difficulties, however. But if we get there, will demand return to the levels that we saw prior to the COVID pandemic? Yeah, my view is it will.
Okay.
And it'll also bring in new segments to the business, expanded segments, may see a depletion of certain ones. But I think probably by the middle of next year, we'll be almost back to normal.
And in terms of the split between leisure and business, you make a very big play about the quality of your business travel experience. That, by all accounts, is not going to come back as quick as leisure. So how do you handle that as you start to kind of ramp up your flight capacity looking into this year? And as you say, some kind of full recovery next year?
Well, again, I remain an optimist. Yes, I said there will be depletion in certain segments, but not as badly as people tend to think. And obviously, those are the corporate segments. But our experience has told us time and time again, whether it be in the Gulf War, whether it be the financial crisis of 708, I can go on to many examples. What has happened is that the inventory that had been allocated to the business segments, you talk about business class, latterly premium economy, and perhaps first class, were taken up very quickly by the higher end leisure segments. And they wanted the flatbeds, they wanted the service, but frankly, they couldn't quite pay the prices that we were charging or others were charging. Right. So what we did was to adjust our price points to encourage the leisure business, particularly in the high end, to travel. And my own view is that you are going to see an enormous rebound in market in demand in those particular segments. Watch the space. I think it's going to happen.
How does the fleet develop? I mean, you talked at the beginning there, Sir Tim, about that, you've been utilising your 777s for cargo. You've got an awful lot of A380s and other aircraft. I mean, how does your kind of strategy around what to do with the fleet kind of evolve over time? Or do you just see it, as you said, by next year, there will be some sense of a full recovery, so it doesn't actually matter?
No, we are of the view that the full fleet will be deployed during the course of the back end of this year, the first quarter of next year, certainly in the summer of next year. That is, of course, contingent upon, as I said earlier, what happens with regard to government understanding of the requirements, with regard to the things I mentioned, vaccines and et cetera, et cetera. But I'm assuming that sense will prevail. The notion that you can suppress air travel indefinitely does enormous damage to the global economy and the various economies of those countries where you have indigenous carriers, most of which countries have them. So I can see this getting sorted, and I can see our fleet coming back into play. We have a number of operating scenarios in train at the moment with regard to what we will do, depending on what markets open up and where, and we will match the fleet requirements. But as far as we're concerned, Emirates will restore the pre-COVID network with its frequencies, its city pairs, and its fleet as it was in, say, December of 2019.
Just interestingly, I mean, you maybe this is just a byproduct of how you've behaved in the past, and this is not a criticism in the way Emirates has behaved in the past. And you say you're bullish. I mean, you're almost the most confident airline CEO that I've heard speak. I mean, what do you put that confidence down to?
I think we've been there before, not to the scale of this pandemic. We have always managed to get the job done, expand our business. After each of the what I call the global disturbances over the last 25 years, Emirates has excelled. It's actually increased its operation. It's increased its profitability and cash build. And I see that this is a changing structural problem. I mean, the facets of it are a little bit different from everybody else, but there is an underlying demand which has been suppressed now for 14 or 15 months. And there is no question about it. Any of us, just man in the street, woman in the street, are wanting to move and get out of this awful situation that they've been subjected to. So there is a bow wave of demand waiting to rock and roll on this. This isn't just about traveling on Emirates. This is about getting out and doing all the things that we were used to doing. But it's been held back. So that'll take care of demand, in my view, for the next 6 to 9 months once we get going. That's why we are confident. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned structural changes. I mean, what do you sense might happen? And we're talking out of the Emirates world now, just in the wider aviation sector. I mean, do you sense we'll see some kind of beg your pardon? Will we see some kind of consolidation? The low cost model is always an interesting one to observe. And I remember going to one of the Kappa events. I believe you were there, and there was a lot of talk about low cost long haul as being this kind of thing to look forward to. I mean, how do you see the models evolving over the next 18 months, 2 years, possibly?
Well, it's a difficult one to answer. At the moment, everybody is hell-bent on sorting out their cash position. And as this situation continues, even the great and the good business models, many of which are in the low-cost area, are facing major cash issues. And the problem they have is recourse to debt and everything else, whether it be state or... So it's a question of survival. Post the pandemic, we've already seen a depletion of a number of carriers. They've already gone out of existence. So it theoretically means that you will have the survival of the fittest, the leanest, the most efficient. Well, that actually hasn't happened because the states have subsidized, put in a lot of money to what could be perceived as inefficient carriers that perhaps shouldn't have been there anyway. But I'm not going to go into all of that. I think it's if we can preserve the aviation community as best we can, it's vital that there are healthy operators providing meaningful competition to provide the price points that consumers want and that will drive our business. If we start over consolidating, prices could eventually rise to the detriment of the traveling public. And then with the sort of inefficiencies that this brings, you'll get processes and practices, best practice starting to be depleted, and the advantage you get from best practice in terms of unit costs will start to be eroded. So we need it to continue. I can't say who's going to be there. We've seen casualties last week. We've seen casualties every week. And it is a fact that there will be probably less capacity, less hardware flying during the course of 21, 22, 23 than prior to the pandemic. How we're going to deal with that? As I said, I think a lot of carriers have a lot of cash issues, balance sheets that have been impaired by debt, and that's going to condition how they operate with what aircraft and on what network.
How do you think we will travel differently in the future? By which I mean, what has happened over the last year has accelerated the development of many things. So we're talking about health passport, or the idea of COVID passports and things like that. Dubai Airport itself, pre the pandemic, was doing a biometric tunnel and things like that. It's a very interesting technological kind of developments. Is there anything that's long lasting, do you think, with around health passports and things that we need to be aware of, and indeed the president of an airline should be aware of, that they should be strategizing for, to use?
Well, it should have been done in process before this started, Kevin. The whole notion of the digitalization of the journey in all touch points, whether it be the carriers, the airports, all the stakeholders, was moving at pace anyway. What the pandemic has done actually is to refocus, or it's a bit of an accelerant with regard to biometrics for all the things you mentioned, whether it be vaccine passports being digitized and accepted across the operating spectrum, whether airports are now accelerating their need to free off the need of people to engage touch and all the other bits and pieces, whether it be touch as check-in, biometric controls through passports in and out, immigration controls in and out, and so on and so forth. That was moving at pace, and anybody who suggests that that should be arrested or held up is nuts. Every CEO should be embracing what the digital aspects of this IT revolution does to the actual processes that drive our businesses at the street level. So by that I mean check-in, passport control, lounges, aircraft itself, the actual the way we go about presenting our products on board, etc., has a view to all of that. So I'm sure this is going to be to the fore in the next year or two.
Pre-pandemic, we get to the end of 2019, and there was a lot of momentum around the discussion of sustainability. We had the rise of kind of flight shaming in some Scandinavian countries, the Greta effect, as some called it, and things like that. And 2020, there were lots of other things to be concerned with. Do you think sustainability and the way the aviation sector is developing with regards to that is going to become back on the agenda again once everyone has figured out how to survive, to be quite flippant?
I don't think it ever left the agenda. And I'm one of these great supporters of what we can do in the industry. Obviously, it's very difficult to suggest that sustainable fuels are going to be affordable to drive an airline like Emirates, unless there is substantial changes in the technology, whether it be hydrogen or whatever. But there are so many other things that we can do and are happening in parallel to our particular industry. Look at automotive, look at the Brits and the 2030 rule with regard to no internal combustion engines being sold. There'll be more of that coming. The investigation, the accelerant in sustainable power is moving far quicker now than I think it has done for many years. Has this anything to do with the pandemic? I don't know. Maybe it's because people have got more time to think about it, how they can be better in their processes, best practices I mentioned earlier, to try, and I talked about digitizing and using AI to get the best, more efficient processes. All this starts to shrink the footprint of businesses, not just in the aviation world. So I think that this is a recognition, whether it be the Greta effect, or whether it be a recognition by the G7, the G20, etc. Now, and of course, the US going back into the Paris Accords, climate change accords. That this is going to get ahead of steam now, which is probably the wrong word in the environmental world, but I can see this doing the right thing by the planet. I'm a great supporter of that. I do have my difficulties in trying to cross over into propulsion of aircraft. So, but everything we can do around it. For instance, if you had a Heathrow, which had as a condition of the third runway, all electric cars. Nothing was allowed into Heathrow unless it was electric. The ramp operation, the catering, the ground handling, everything was electric. And you started to take out all the carbon emissions from the ramp operation, which are huge, by the way.
Yeah. So almost a trade-off, as you say. So thank you very much to Tim Clark for joining us at ITB Now. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.